welcome Jan Lee, also known as Genevieve Hilton. And Jan Lee is your pseudonym for writing. And that's what I'm going to call you during the interview, easier than Genevieve. And welcome to Ordinary Visionaries. I'm really excited to interview you today.
Very happy to be here and excited to finally meet you, not in person, but at least face to face.
Yeah, well, thank you. So tell me, Jan, how are you an ordinary visionary?
You know, there's two parts of this. One is the ordinary and one is the visionary. So the
Yes.
ordinary sense, I'm someone who had a very conventional career for many years. I worked at a public relations agency, started another agency, sold that, went in-house, worked at big multinational corporations, got into sustainability, corporate affairs. But on the other side, one of the things that I've been doing that entire time was writing, and specifically writing science fiction stories and all kinds of, I'll call them visionary stories. And as a matter of fact, a lot of that itself got started because I was telling bedtime stories to my kids when it was very difficult to spend any time with the kids when I was working very hard in corporate
Sure.
life. I would come
Sure.
home and I said, this is one thing I'm going to do. I'm going to tell a bedtime story every single night. And, you know, after a while, you run out of fairy tales. So I started to make them up. And as the kids got older, they started to get more complicated and have, you know, more intricate plots. And I started to, after the kids were in bed, I'd go sit in my own bed and type up the story that I had just told.
That just came out of your head, right?
Generally
Love
speaking, yes.
Yes.
And occasionally I really ran out of stories and would say, you know, let me tell you the terrible story of the press release that needed to get 34 approvals before it was issued. And so I take things from work as well.
Yes.
And so this is a great technique, by the way, for honing the storytelling craft, is to try to keep a couple of kids interested in the stories. And I think I did pretty well. They liked the stories. But eventually I started writing those down properly. As I mentioned, started submitting stories and started to get a few of them published in literary magazines. Eventually published a collection of them, just to draw a line under it. This was just a self-published one on Amazon. And about 2 years ago, I retired from my job.
One second, before you go there. Anyone that's listening to this, I just started to read your short story collection, and I loved the hell out of it. The stories are absolutely fantastic. They're sort of in alternate worlds or situations in the future. I've only read 3 of them so far. And they're so compelling, so interesting, so immediate. I just love them. It's really going to get me back into reading, I think, reading these stories. So,
that's fantastic to hear.
So, yeah, I mean, and I felt so inspired today. I read 2 of the stories this morning, and I don't know, it just lit my brain up. It was fantastic. What's the name of the collection, the first collection again?
So the name of that collection is Route 1. And by the way, that is under a previous pseudonym called Jan Chu. So I changed to Jan Lee after that one was published.
Right. Okay.
So Route 1 is the first story in the collection, and it's about, it's essentially a few years after the aliens have showed up on Earth, and their ship crashed into the North Atlantic. And the premise of that story is about the first legal case of a rape involving an alien.
Yes.
So,
and it's a very, very visual story too, because you describe these things as looking a little bit like with a kangaroo tail, and I won't go into the details. And they don't really talk, and they eat different food, and they have a mask over their face to breathe, and it's absolutely mind-bending, because you just think of all the ramifications of that, but we usually think of the usual kind of monster from outer space, and they're very different than that.
Yeah.
It's just so imaginative, really.
That's what I hope, is to look at a lot of times through the lens of when different human populations have contacted each other unexpectedly. that informs a lot of my alien contact stories. And they're not always what you expect. Sometimes the other group of humans are something you have a lot of in common with. Sometimes they seem very alien, and this has happened, throughout human history. But also, if you meet someone from, the next town over, and they can be very different, or you can have a lot in common.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think after that, I had been publishing stories, as I mentioned, in that collection. I'd been publishing them in literary magazines, and I started my own literary magazine after I retired, and that is under
Well,
the
you're like
auspices.
me. You're not really retiring. You're just doing a different project because you don't have to make the money,
Well,
right?
exactly. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm a little bit young to be just playing mahjong all day and
Yeah.
having coffee with the ladies.
You
So
live in Hong Kong, by the way. We forgot
yes,
to
I do.
mention that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So in
which is
fact,
interesting.
the magazine is under the umbrella of the Hong Kong Writers Circle, which is,
Okay.
a collection of writers who, they're writing anything. They're journalists, they're fiction writers, they're poets.
Yeah.
And we had an annual anthology, but we didn't have a magazine yet. So I decided, hey, I've got the time, I'll start a magazine. And this was interesting because I started posting about this on LinkedIn. Now, because I'd spent so many years in the corporate world, a lot of my friends were on LinkedIn, not necessarily on, Facebook or Instagram.
Right,
And
right.
I got an interesting message in April of 2023 from this guy called Steve Willis, who is an engineer based in Malaysia.
Hmm.
He's British, but he's lived in Malaysia for many years, just as I've lived in Hong Kong for most of my adult life. And he also wrote short stories. And he also had been working for many years for a chemical company, different one from my own, but same industry. And said, I've been writing these stories about the climate. So I got a message from this guy called Steve Willis, an engineer based in Malaysia, and
Yeah.
he told me he'd been writing these climate stories, and he had already published a collection of climate stories, one by him, or I think one or two by himself, but the others through that he'd gathered from various places. And this is right at the beginning of when this topic of cli-fi started to emerge. So cli-fi is
I
climate
love it.
fiction, just like sci-fi. Yeah, so it's a real term now. This is like you can find whole cli-fi segments on Amazon now.
Wow. Wow.
And the idea of writing climate fiction had only kind of just started to come up. I think Kim Stanley Robinson was one of he was a mainstream science fiction author. He wrote he wrote like the Red Mars, Green Mars books. I think he's quite famous in that area. And he'd written a climate fiction book called Ministry for the Future, which
Hmm.
is quite a shocking, has a shocking first chapter in which 20 million people die in a heat wave. And, you don't read that the first thing before you go to bed because it will give you nightmares. Um,
I can
and
imagine.
so at the same time, I had just seen a contest out of the magazine Grist in the United States. It's an environmental magazine running a climate fiction short story contest. So I asked Steve, "Oh, you're going to enter any of your stories in Grist?" He said, "I don't know. How about you?" I said, "I'm thinking about it, still searching for inspiration." And he said the magic words, "Do you want to collaborate?" We wrote a short story based on some material that he already had and some material that had been floating around in my head about a family in Malaysia who had started up a project on an unused oil rig. And
Hmm.
after that, we said, this is something is working here.
Hmm.
Steve is very much, absolutely an engineer, knows the technical details of everything. He's been on oil rigs a lot. And,
Right. That helps, doesn't it?
oh, yeah. So he can describe every single thing. I've probably got a little bit more experience in the craft of writing, and I also was back in the corporate headquarters. So I know how organizational structures work. I know how corporate
Right, right.
politics work. I know how projects get funded. We didn't win the short story contest at Grist, but in the spirit of, if someone refuses to lend you $5, why not ask for 500? We entered a novel contest. Uh, and we had written, I think, the first chapter, the middle chapter, and the last chapter, which is what you're supposed to enter. And to our surprise, we did win a prize in that one, which included publishing the novel. And we hadn't written the thing yet. So
just 3 chapters.
Yeah, we'd written the 3 chapters, thinking, what the hell. So the next thing we did was, work like hell, lickety split to write the rest of the damn thing. And we did, and we previewed it at COP20. I guess that would have been COP28 last fall. So it's Conference of the Parties for the UN Framework on Climate Change. We had a preview copy ready by then, and then we launched the book at the Hong Kong International Literary Festival in March of this year.
So how long did it take to write it and get it all done?
Probably about a month and a half, all told.
A month and a half? That's
to finish
really fast.
To finish the draft. Yeah, and then, of course, you go through the editing process.
Sure.
I had many long and interesting discussions with the publisher. It's a smaller academic publisher out of University of Southampton who specializes in environmental fiction.
Oh.
And the differences between English, because it's supposed to be written in British English, which is not my native language, and the differences that I did not suspect, the use of commas, for example, are
the Oxford
just incredible.
Comma.
It's not only the Oxford comma; they have a whole different system. So that was really, that stuff took a very long time, and getting the cover design. We have an amazing cover designer, Nancy Locos, she usually does abstract art, but she made us an amazing cover, which I'll show you this one, by the way. So it's
and we'll create a link to this, of course.
This, by the way, it shows one of the projects in the book, which is this kind of called ocean nutrification, through which you can create carbon capture under the water, and it takes advantage of unused or abandoned offshore oil rigs. And this
now, is that concept science fiction or fanciful, or is it real?
So it's a real thing. The solutions are all real, but just the people are fictional. And on the back, you see, what if it doesn't happen?
All
right. So this is the dead ocean, and this is the living ocean.
Wow.
That's one of 3 major climate, solutions to address the climate that are featured in the book. One of them is probably much more along the lines of adaptation. So that's the book itself. Fairhaven is about a large land reclamation and seawall project in Penang, Malaysia, which is right now being plagued by floods. Every time there's a rainstorm, they really get hit hard. There's a huge one in 2017, for example. So the Fairhaven project is a large-scale infrastructure project to adapt to the climate change that is already here, that is happening now. The Sea Orchards project you see there on the cover of the book is a way to address the root cause, which is too much carbon dioxide, can mean too much greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, and to use a nature-based solution to absorb CO2 using biomass underwater. And we have another solution featured in the book, which is Arctic ice refreezing, which is somewhere in the middle. So that is
Arctic ice refreezing. I love that.
So you spray water from underneath. During the winter, you spray water from underneath the sea onto the existing ice sheets to thicken them, such that they don't melt as. So that there will be more ice, even though it's still melting, as the heat's still rising, the temperature is still rising, it'll still melt. But the albedo effect of having more ice will help to create kind of a stopgap measure while we do all the other things that we need to do, like the switch to renewable energy.
Is that actually happening, that misting of the ice?
There are 4 teams doing that in the Arctic right now. Nobody at scale, and nobody doing it nearly at the scale that's pictured in the book. But it's going on at a small level now.
So you've got all this technology to mitigate climate change, but what's the kind of plot of the story? What's the dramatic arc? What do how is
Yeah.
that?
So
Don't have to give away everything, but just to give a sense of what the book's like that way.
the main character is called Grace Chan, and she's a little bit of an every woman, or almost a stand-in for the reader. So you first meet her in 2036, when she's already a politician, and
Uh-huh.
you're kind of wondering, how did she get there? She almost crashes her car on the dike of Fairhaven, this land project, which at that point has already been built. And the sea is rising. She's stuck in the water. She thinks she's going to die, so she reviews her life. And so you go
Ah.
back to meet Grace Chan when she was a kid, as she grows up, as she's affected by climate change, how she started working on this Fairhaven project. And then eventually, there she found love. She met, or did she? You'll find out by the end of the book. Anyway, she met a guy called Hans, who's Dutch and had a lot of experience, obviously, with land reclamation and sea management, coastal management from Netherlands. She eventually has a lot of problems with her own life, and interestingly, she gets catapulted into fame a little bit accidentally, uh, which, again, I won't tell you too many of the details, but she is herself an author in the book, so she writes short stories in the book.
Sounds familiar.
And yeah, sounds familiar. And so we've included 4 of those short stories in the book there at various
Oh,
intervals.
wow.
So in
Wow.
case you don't think you can handle the whole novel, you can just read Grace Chan's short stories.
Yeah.
So she ends up also working on, or connected to, the other projects in the book. So that's how we see them through different eyes.
Yeah.
But so there's some really dramatic stuff that happens, I'd say, in Act 3, that that's going to be a huge spoiler alert if I even allude to it. So,
Okay.
but when
So,
you read it, you realize, oh, it was sneakily signaled in Chapter 1, but I wasn't paying attention at the time.
yeah. So, do you have what's the word? A real passion for finding solutions to climate change?
The subtitle of this novel is Fairhaven, a novel of climate optimism.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of pessimism in the world today. There are,
No kidding.
and
resignation.
anxiety is on, and resignation
Yes.
and climate anxiety, especially among teenagers.
Yeah.
I'll talk about that in a minute. But the idea that, it's too late, can't do anything.
Yeah.
Well, it's definitely going to get worse before it gets better. But
Yeah.
I'm not ready to give up yet. Let's find some things we can do. And there are so many things. There's so many technologies available right now already that have the possibilities, and that some of them are being deployed, just not necessarily at scale.
Yeah.
And that's been a fantastic thing about publishing the novel, by the way, is that we've started to get questions from investors. I had a fantastic
Oh, really?
I had a fantastic session at it was kind of a sustainable finance group, and they asked me to come and do a reading from the book, which I did, and then I got a lot of questions, in the Q&A afterwards, or in the cocktail party and so forth afterwards, like, so tell me, where are some of these projects that I can invest in? And that's been fascinating. And Steve's found the same thing in Malaysia. He's even from some surprising sources, like oil companies, who say, okay, well, we've got a lot of unused oil rigs. Can we do this? There's something that's right now called a rigs to reef concept. That exists in many places already. But in the book, we take it a little bit further by offering what we're calling blue carbon credits. So just as you can get carbon credits for planting trees, by creating new biomass in the ocean, then in principle you should be able to sell blue carbon credits for that. At this moment, there's not a certification body that allows it, but that is something that has been created for carbon credits on land. So there's a pathway to it that we can see where it could be done at sea. Same thing with albedo credits. There's not currently a certification mechanism for albedo credits, but that could be a very natural way to finance projects like that.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, do you see a world in which there are platforms all over the world re decarbonizing the oceans so that plants regrow? I mean, that's the whole
There,
idea behind it, right?
there are thousands and thousands of unused oil rigs which can be converted tomorrow to this project, this type of project. It's not
Wow,
particularly complicated, and it's described in a
right.
fair amount of detail, and I hope in an engaging way, how you actually would do it. I mean, in the book, uh,
I don't know
there's
if you know about. Uh, Sorry, we got two ideas going two ways. Let me finish my thought. And there's um, a guy that started an organization called Charity Water, and his intention is that everyone in the world will have good, clean water. And they've built 150,000 wells. And this is
wow,
driven by one person, and he's built an organization and a
wow,
way to raise money. And you think, gee, why couldn't the United Nations do that? This is one person. You know, the United Nations, look at everything they've done, all the governments of the world. The USA could do that easily. What they've raised relative to our national is not very much money, but 150,000 well, and every well costs $10,000 or 100, I don't know how much, a lot of money. But they've raised enough money to do that, and they continue to do it every day. They're digging new wells, mostly in Africa and other
amazing, well done.
places. It's extraordinary, and you think, with the intention, with the focus, with the commitment, you know, obviously the technology to drill wells has been around for a long time. This is kind of a
Hmm.
new thing, but that's a really exciting thing. Thousands of
Yeah,
abandoned
fantastic.
wells, let's do something.
The idea of
Yeah,
converting existing infrastructure to a new use is something that often gets overlooked, because once a technology is out, then you don't think about it. Oh, well, so that's trash. That's over. But the
yeah,
concept of having a circular economy in which the waste is not considered to be waste, but a raw material, has been adopted by more than one area. So we usually think of circular economy like, okay, my plastic drink bottle, I put it into the recycling, that gets melted down, and it's now the raw material for the new drink bottle. That's kind of the
yeah,
simplest
yeah,
type
yeah,
of circular economy. But if we think about things, expanding that concept not only to consumer waste, but yeah, to things like oil rigs, to things like unused shrimp farms, then how can we look at the type of coastal areas with that are suffering from climate change induced flooding right now? Maybe a lot of them are going to be buildings that aren't able to be used in the future. Is that waste, or can that be converted back to mangrove terraces, which could be a considerable carbon sink? And by the way, have a fantastic role in coastal protection as well. And
yeah,
by the way, cost a
yeah,
lot less than seawalls.
yeah. And it's
So
natural. It's trees, for God's sake.
yeah, but you need to do it, right? I mean, if you
Yeah.
just abandon a place, it's not necessarily going to, revert to a mangrove coast within the next week by Tuesday at 4 o'clock. That's not how it happens.
I know. It's kind of a generational thing, isn't it, for things
Yeah,
like
and
that?
we don't
Yeah.
necessarily have time to think generation. No, we have time to think generationally, but we don't have time to act generationally. So this is
Yeah. Yeah.
happening now.
Yeah.
I mean, the timeline of our book is, like I said, more or less the 2020s is when most of the action, late 2020s, early 2030s is when most of the action happens. But the final chapter is in 2102. That's the timeline we're talking about here. We are not. We can't think about like, oh well, let my grandchildren solve this problem. But again, the title of the book is
Yeah.
Optimism. It can be done. Like, yes, it's already started. Climate change has already started. We will see it get worse before it gets better. We will need to take adaptation measures as well as mitigation measures. But that doesn't mean we say, oh, give up, throw up my hands and say, oh yeah, too late. It's already, nothing can be done. Oh, that's the topic I wanted to bring up as
Yeah.
well, was climate anxiety. This is something that's also addressed in the book. The main character, Grace, and her boyfriend, Hans, have climate anxiety. And actually, they they kind of get together for the first time when they attend a sort of an AA type of meeting of climate anxiety, people suffering from climate anxiety, like attend a
Oh, really?
support group.
Is that a real thing?
Yes, actually.
Is it?
It's not very widespread yet, but there are groups of people who, like a support group for climate anxiety. We're hoping that this type of support group spreads more broadly in the world, but I think it's pretty limited right now.
Yeah.
And and the thing is, climate anxiety is absolutely real, and it's affecting young people in particular. I have heard, and I've been reading a lot of studies on this because I gave a lecture on the topic recently, and it's been observed in kids as young as 6, 7, 8 years old, and
Really? Wow.
especially in teenagers. That's something that I didn't think about before we published this book very much. That uh, I thought, okay, this book probably sustainability people, maybe some speculative fiction people will like it. But I've been talking to a lot of moms of depressed teenagers who said they got this book, or they read it and then they gave it to their son or to their daughter. I gave a talk at a women's association, sort of women's association night not too long ago, and one of the people there said she'd bought the book for her son, and the son said, "Oh, I can't quite imitate a disaffected teenage boy, but he said something along the, it's the first time I ever saw climate and optimism in the same sentence." And like,
Right.
oh wow, you know, that's you know that's heavy. And we a
Yeah.
lot of
It's
of
like
the
ordinary visionaries.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we a lot of the time, like as we said, we were thinking in these big, in these grand schemes, oil rigs and Arctic refreezing, and and mangrove plantations and terraces and things like that. But yeah, on the other hand, if you can positively affect one teenager, that's big too. Uh,
Yeah.
and but yeah, of course, it's not only teenagers. When we've been to a lot of climate events, like I said, Steve went to COP28 last year, and said you talk to the climate scientists, and they're saying like, "Oh, here's my solution, and here's my solution," and then when you talk to them, like, "What do you think? Are we going to make it?" And their face falls and say, "Yeah, well." So, but this is possibly, in our opinion, it's possibly because they're often looking at their particular area, and they're so focused, and they see all of the challenges ahead of them, and they don't necessarily see the big picture, like the fact that China's conversion to renewable energy has already been massive. And on one hand, you
Hmm.
think, oh well, the coal-fired power production in China rose in the last few years. It's still rising. But on the other hand, you look at the fact that 60% of their cars last year, their vehicles that they produced last year, sold last year in China, were EVs. That conversion is
Wow.
already underway. The
That's
60%. So this
gigantic. Do you know
is
what it is
gigantic.
in the U.S. right now? I have an EV. I
Significantly
love it.
less. Oh,
Yeah.
do you? Yeah. Well, you live in California. It's the charging infrastructure, I think, is a bit better
There's
there.
a lot of Teslas. You see a lot of Teslas here. I have a
Hmm.
Nissan Leaf, which I love, and it's great. But
Yeah, I mean, I think
yeah,
companies like BYD in China have completely taken off in a way that uh, if you look at if someone asked me in 2009 or something, should I invest in BYD? It's like, yeah, it seemed all right, like car company, China. Now, completely, it's a dominant. It's a huge company, and they're excuse me, very successful. So we also see things like even the fact of you disparage the UN a little bit, and I love to do the same thing. On the other hand, big multilateral agreements do happen. They do make a difference. I recently had the fortune to talk to Todd Stern. He was the U.S. climate envoy for the Paris Climate Agreement, and for
hmm,
years before that. And he's recently written a book himself where he describes the process of getting to that agreement and how tortuous it is. But the fact is, when all those countries, all those nations, all those parties agree, at the end, they get to this agreement. It has a lot of resilience. So even the Paris Agreement that the United States pulled out of the agreement a few days after we signed it, um, it kind of went on anyway. It kept on happening. And that all the other 194 countries that had signed the agreement, it went ahead. So even without the United States, it kept going. And when you build up a consensus like that, overall that time, with all of that effort, it tends to stick. And it seems like not very much is happening, or they're just talking about wording, but it is the groundwork, it is the framework on which all the
Yes.
rest of this is built. So, I mean, we couldn't be
Right.
talking about any kind of financing of any kind of credits, carbon credits, blue carbon credits, albedo credits, except for the idea that was brought up during the Kyoto Protocol many years ago. So these things are the framework on which the rest of it is built.
Right. I'm a little bit disappointed that we haven't heard more about climate change in our presidential election campaign.
Well,
yeah, and
I mean,
we're
preaching to the
guardedly
choir here.
optimistic that Kamala will be elected better than Trump in terms of climate change, we think. But
one thing that I also found very interesting coming from the United States is a few months, was it last year, I think I met your governor, Gavin Newsom, when he was in Hong Kong.
Oh.
And he reinforced, I think, what a lot of people maybe don't necessarily realize, is that the California climate legislation it's very far ahead of the rest of the United States, and to a certain extent far ahead of the rest of the world. And where California goes, everybody else has to go. Because if you're going to manufacture a car and you can't sell it in California, then you might as well not be manufacturing a car. Therefore, California sets the stage, and they're already something like I think the 6th largest economy in the world. Newsom
we're big, really big.
Newsom made a very funny comment. He said, and we're coming for you, Germany. So I think Germany is the current number 5. So if you think about not necessarily at a national level, there is maybe some reason for optimism, even in the United States, even in the case of national politics, no matter what happens at the national, political, or the federal level.
Yeah. Things like solar are growing, but you think, all the homes in California, I tried to get solar on our house, but we have too many trees. I'm in a redwood forest, too much shade on my roof. But we did have a Tesla wall installed, so when we have blackouts, the power will come on without using the generator. So
cool.
Everybody here in the woods has a generator, because when we get a little bit of wind in the winter, branches fall, power goes down, sometimes for 3 or 4 or 5 days. It's a lot of fun. Other than that.
I mean, there are enormous opportunities everywhere. So take Australia, for example. Population isn't huge, but it's got a hell of a lot of sun. And the cost of solar production has just plummeted, meaning that they might be in a position to be a power exporter in the future, and thus move away from their current dependence on natural gas, which is kind of their big natural resource right now. So moving from thinking about oil and gas as natural resources to thinking about the sun as a natural resource, and yes, to a certain extent wind, although wind's fallen a little bit behind solar in terms of renewable. Even the switch to, let's say, the different understanding of the potential of nuclear power has, for a lot of, say, Gen 1 conservationists, nuclear power is the devil. But I think that's probably not the case now, given that, the immediate consequences of climate change are going to be a lot worse than the potential single accident somewhere.
Well, I read a very interesting article just recently about the development of smaller nuclear power plants that are easier and faster to build. And so that might be the way they go, is many, many of those instead of, the gigantic ones that are a little more dangerous.
And the generation of leaders in Europe who were traumatized as adolescents by the Chernobyl incident are starting
Hmm.
to retire now. So
Ah.
we can probably see a few
Ah.
more people who aren't who don't have that sort of visceral emotional reaction that a lot of the I call this the Angela Merkel generation. She,
Right.
with her so-called Energiewende, she shows up in one of Grace Chan's stories, by the way.
Oh.
Yeah, what if? And that's something I should also mention. That so the stories in the book that are written by Grace Chan are actually counterfactual disaster stories. So they're stories about real disasters, like the sinking of the Titanic, or the Challenger explosion, or
Hmm.
Chernobyl. Um, but they're written as a counterfactual. In other words, what if they didn't happen? What could have prevented it from happening, or how could people have been saved, or some people have been saved?
Yeah.
So they all act as metaphors for climate change. So, like, yeah, we see the disaster coming. Could we act now to prevent or mitigate, or at least address the looming
Yeah.
disaster? It's not. So the idea is the disaster is not inevitable. So those 4 stories that are in Fairhaven are, 4 of those stories, and we are now going to publish a companion volume to Fairhaven, which is all the other stories that Grace Chan wrote, so all the other disasters and how
Oh.
they might have been prevented.
Mankind does not seem to be particularly brilliant at preventing disasters, it seems. Although, on the other hand, we have God knows how many nuclear weapons, and there hasn't been a major nuclear weapon accident. That's obviously it feels like an accident ready to happen. Just thinking about that is terrifying. What if one nutcase and gets a platoon of God knows and other nutcases and. But
Well, it's interesting to think in the context of climate anxiety. I have
yeah,
heard a lot of people say that express the emotion that, like, how could I bring children into a world that's going to be devastated by climate change?
yeah,
And it made me think about the fact that my own parents told me that when they had us, they were. My mom said she really thought twice. How could I bring children into a world that's dominated by these 2 superpowers bent on mutually assured destruction?
yeah,
And but she did, and we've managed so far. And it made me think, well, what about my parents who were born more or less at the end of World War II? What did their parents think? Did their parents say, like, how can I bring children into a world where the armies of Europe and Asia are at each other's throats, and it looks like the world is ending? And yet they did, and we managed to get through it. So uh, their parents, I don't know what they might have been thinking, but the idea that, like, oh, it's
yeah,
all over, why give up? We've been thinking that for years, and still okay.
yeah. Something that President Biden has said many, many times is, I feel more optimistic now than ever. He really sees a positive future, and the solutions are there. We have
Yes.
to embrace them, understand them, work against the opposition, make very strong arguments, get agreement in Congress. It's not an easy process to do big things like this. But
That's certainly something that I learned from Todd Stern, as I mentioned, like the degree of dealing with multilateral organizations. It's nothing compared to dealing with the U.S. Congress.
yeah, I mean, it's been ridiculous for a long time.
Mm.
It
Um,
just seems to be about winning and fighting, but that's a whole other different thing.
that's a whole other
We,
topic.
we're
But coming
we're
back
we're
to
yeah,
one thing you just mentioned, the technologies are already there. I wanted to
yeah,
recap or bring up again the fact that not only are the technologies are already there, but there are other technologies which have not been considered in the past, which we now can rethink. So one of the examples we just touch on in Fairhaven, but we're going to go into a little bit more in the sequel, is Zeppelins. So we see
Zeppelins.
so the Goodyear blimp. Um,
Yeah,
is,
Yeah.
goes around. You see it advertising over a sports stadium, but no
Yeah.
one's used a hydrogen blimp since the Hindenburg, essentially, and the
Yeah.
R101, which is like the British Hindenburg that also crashed on its maiden voyage. That's because the
Right.
technology to do it safely didn't exist in the early part of the 20th century. If we think about the potential applications of a much safer hydrogen Zeppelin using current technologies to manage the hydrogen in a better way, then we can think about other applications like lifting windmill blades onto the towers, onto the wind turbine towers. We can think about using
Mm.
Zeppelins couldn't use them to fight wildfires because the flames rise too high, but we can use them to fight peat fires that are slow burning and enormously devastating.
Oh.
Things like, that
Yeah.
Zeppelins is just one. What about biochar? This is a very simple technology, but one that has an enormous potential, especially in Southeast Asia, for example. So all of these things are something we thought, okay, that's primitive, that's old-fashioned, we gave up on that. But let's take a second look and use the technology we have today to scale up these things. You might call them, primitive technologies or outdated or unused, and see what we can do with them today. So there's a lot of options out there and a lot of potential.
Wow. I sometimes wish I was younger. I'm 72, but who knows? I have a few years left. I'm so interested to see how the future turns out because humanity and the human mind is virtually unlimited in terms of coming up with new possibilities, ideas, technology, cooperation. I mean, look
Yeah.
what we've done. Look at the cities that we've built. Look at the
Yeah.
ridiculously massive freeways that we've built and all our technology, the airports, airplanes. We went to the moon more than 50 years ago. I mean,
So
for God's sake, it's within our grasp to find a way.
we started out
Really is.
speaking about science fiction. One of my favorite science fiction authors is Greg Bear, in particular his Eon series. So I think Eon was the main one. There was Eternity was the sequel, and there was kind of a prequel called Legacy, I think. And one of the, almost a science fiction trope, that after someone dies, their personality is uploaded to the mainframe, or uploaded in this context.
What's the name of it? Because there's a TV series that's related to that. I can't remember the name.
So the author
Continuum
is Greg Bear.
or something.
The author is Greg Bear, and the book is Eon.
Eon,
it's
okay.
much more ambitious in scope than just that thing. By the way, it opens when there's a spaceship asteroid from the future shows up in the Earth's in the Earth's orbit, and that's almost the most plausible, believable thing that starts out with. So, but it's
Right.
cosmic in scope, this book, and
right.
that idea of are we going to be around to see what happens? Well, maybe. Maybe not in this, limited by this mortal form, but we may figure out a way within our own lifetimes to transfer our consciousness to some electronic format, and hope we don't have to pay too many subscription fees to keep it alive.
Yeah, well, that's who knows? I was thinking the other day and watching something on television. I like sci-fi. I've been a Star Trek fan since I was a kid. I was a young kid at home, 10 or 12 years old when Star Trek started, and I've watched every series, every movie, even the most recent ones, just absolutely enthralled by them. And of a future that has, relatively speaking, more conscious people that know how to cooperate, although, some of it's just silly, but it's inspiring. And yet so much on television and the media is about destruction because that's easier to do.
Yeah.
The city blows up, God knows what.
It's very tough to write
Yeah.
utopias because if everything is going fine, then it's kind of boring. So, and
Yeah.
that was one of
Yeah.
the key things that I think when we were writing Fairhaven, is we saw there's so many pessimistic, climate fiction novels out there. I mean, the drowned world, the water knife, the destruction, and there's an adolescent coming of age in a post-apocalyptic world. Like, there's a lot of, that can describe a lot of books. And
Yeah.
at the same time, you just mentioned Star Trek. We thought about the so-called Star Trek effect, which is when someone invents a thing because they saw it on Star Trek, because someone had
Yeah.
envisioned the thing. So you look at so many of the devices and everything we have today, a lot of that
Like my
was
iPad,
was
They
envisioned on
basically had
Star Trek.
iPad on Star Treks.
Yeah.
They didn't call them that, but
And that we see that in social factors as well. So take, for example, you mentioned President Biden. He first said his thinking on the social issue of same-sex marriage was transformed when he watched Will and Grace.
ah,
And that sitcom significantly changed the way Americans think about that particular social issue.
yeah,
We have
yeah,
also, I mean, we've also seen it the other way. The or even going back into history, something like Uncle Tom's Cabin.
oh yeah,
Converted a lot of people, and it's been called the book that started the Civil War. But if I think about it, maybe from a positive point of view, it was one of the first books that gave the majority of the people who read it, and it was a hit. But thinking about the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, as I said, it's been credited as the book that started the Civil War, but it is, if we think about it from a positive point of view, as a bestseller of its time, it gave people empathy for the main characters that it described, who were enslaved people in the southern United States. And
yeah,
that provision of empathy and to be able to visualize something and in your own mind, your own imagination, is the power that fiction and popular film and fiction has, that nobody's ever going to read the COP29 is going to happen in November. Everyone's going to read the report if they're in the business, but who's going to, who in the common, the common man's not going to read the technical reports, but they might read a book, they might watch a TV show, and
oh yeah,
we'd rather have them read something that is optimistic, that showcases a future where the solutions are being used, where the things worked.
I wonder if there's an association, maybe you, maybe somebody that you're associated with, an organization that is in communication with the film industry with throwing out ideas. I mean, the day that somebody calls and says we want to make Fairhaven into a movie or a series would be exciting. Could happen, you know.
Well, we are absolutely open for that, but we are currently novices in the ways of Hollywood. So, perhaps you're a few kilometers closer to it. You know more about it than we do. But there
Yeah.
is actually there's a Climate Fiction Writers League, and there's something Hollywood Climate Week that happened a couple months ago, and
Oh,
their purpose, the purpose of the organization that runs that, is not necessarily to make positive climate fiction, but to incorporate climate fiction into anything that's happening, the storylines of Hollywood, which, at a certain point you have to, right? You can't not
yeah.
incorporate climate change, because it would be foolish, it would
Yes.
be unrealistic to do so.
Yeah, but it
So
would be
that's what
lovely
they're
if
trying
every
to do.
story wasn't about a frickin' disaster.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice?
I mean, maybe on the edge of a disaster, there's a solution. I don't know.
Right.
But, you know, it's something that has to be thought up in the minds of people, conceived, thought of, seen as
Yeah.
marketable, and ultimately, So, this is part of the purpose of ordinary visionaries, to ideas spring forth,
Good. Well,
Who knows where things can go?
from your mouth to Hollywood's ears, or to the Netflix executive's ears who wants to put together a new series, we're absolutely ready to support that.
I think of the sci-fi shows I saw in the last few years. There's one in which they're able to go back into the future, and in the future, Earth is attacked by these horrific, monstrous beings from another planet. So they take people from the present and teleport them into the future to fight these awful beings. I mean, it's pretty wacky, but that's easier to do. Obviously, it's basically a monster flick. Something like
Yeah.
this, how to find something that that would people would watch that, people would like that, people would be inspired by that.
Well, I mean,
Well, there was
I
one.
have to confess that the book is not 100% happy the whole way through. I mean, the people encounter
Yeah.
real issues, and there are disasters.
Well, it's good.
But and yes, the main character, she sleeps around a little bit while she's on her Hollywood jaunt, and there's a lot that happens to the characters, but also a lot that they cause to happen. And I think that's the difference. Rather than just sort of sitting back and taking it while the world is changing around them, they're taking action.
Right. It's exciting stuff, Jan. I mean, we have, when we have great problems, think of the American West. At a certain point, they said, well, we've got the East Coast and the West Coast, and, a couple thousand miles in between. And they built the railroad, and building the railroad was no small feat. It was in the middle of no technology whatsoever. It was the barren plain, except for the Indians, right? So they figured it out, killing innumerable Indians in the process. So,
by the way, that topic, I would say, called colonialism, is a rich source for science fiction plots. There's another book that I've written on my own. Haven't actually published it yet, but stay tuned. Which is based on the North American colonization, or it's inspired by the North American colonization by Europe. But instead of Europe colonizing America, it's aliens and colonizing Earth. And if you look at it, you start to see all the parallels. How were people treated? How were why did the colonization happen so this one is written from the aliens' point of view rather than the Earthlings' point of view, which makes it a little bit unusual.
Very interesting. Well, I'm not too worried about aliens.
No, space, as Douglas Adams said, is big.
Yeah. Really big, more than we can even conceive big. But so here we are on this little spinning orb, trying to survive, trying to get along, trying to cooperate, trying to make things work, trying to have more love than hate.
And for now, this is the planet we've got, and if we think about colonizing other planets, we have to make sure this one's still operating. As of yet, we are not capable of surviving elsewhere without resources from this planet. So, got to keep this one going for at least a few more years.
At least a few more years. So, any final thoughts on where you're going with this, with these ideas, with this movement? You're continuing to write. Are you going to continue with your writing partner? Do you think there's new ongoing possibilities there?
So Fairhaven itself is actually the first book of a series. We've finished and published Fairhaven. We are going to be writing. We're going to be publishing with the same publisher, Defying Futility, which is the companion volume of the short stories of Grace Chan. And then after that, we've already started writing, not yet finished, the sequel to Fairhaven, which it's slightly overlapped. So it has some of the same characters, but not all of them. It's a few different locations. So most of Fairhaven takes place in Malaysia, Japan, and the Arctic. Whereas the sequel will be, a lot of it's happening in Bangladesh and Uzbekistan, and a little bit of it in North America as well.
Wow.
So that's probably the next big project. On my own, I'm going to get around to getting the final edit on the big unpublished. That's finished but not published yet. So
Do you have a name
yeah,
for that
that's
one yet?
reconciliation.
Oh, nice name.
The that one is the main character is an alien who, several generations after the colonization happened, is in charge of the Reconciliation Project, where she's trying to restore land rights to the indigenous Earthlings who were defrauded during the early parts of colonization.
Wow. You have a
But it's
very
actually,
fertile mind.
well, I tell you, it's all based. That one's all based on history. So it's essentially the story of the Canadian residential schools.
Ah, wow. I happen to be Canadian.
Ah, right.
My
So it's probably a topic
my
you know
mother
well.
was very involved in Native rights. So a lot of that stuff filtered down to me, social justice and all of those kind of things always was interesting to me. So
Hence the visionary aspect, I think.
yeah, who
Was your mom
knows?
an
Who knows
ordinary
where anything?
visionary?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
She's
No, that's
long
fantastic.
gone, but she was really something.
Well, yeah, I think then if you ask me for the final thoughts, hope that everyone who's watching your show will take a look at the book, and please include the link. And
Yes, for
I'm
sure.
very happy to see that. I think as of last night, I asked someone to Google it, and it was actually showing up in the top search results. So we're getting there. And if
Good.
you read it, leave a review on Amazon,
Okay.
because Jeffrey Bezos still controls a lot of this stuff, and so
Yes,
that'll help.
he does, doesn't he? Thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview. I found it fascinating and exciting, and it's really got my head spinning. So I wish you all the best of luck, and hopefully we'll connect. We're going to be doing other things with Ordinary Visionaries, getting together as groups to brainstorm and do
Great,
things. We're going to do something after the election.
very good.
Your timing is terrible for it, though, because you're in Hong Kong, but yeah.
Well, our mornings and your evenings are all right for California, but if you want to include the people on the East Coast, then it gets a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, it does. Anyway,
Yeah.
stay tuned, and
Very much looking forward to seeing what's coming.
thank you, Jan. Thank you very much.